So, Cokie, I figured that your father and my father overlapped in the Congress 19 years.
The Mailliards and the Boggses were very good friends, and we would just have drinks with each other. I mean, I was not having drinks, but the grown-ups were. And it was, a time when members of Congress of opposite parties were very good friends. And I can make a case that friendship made a tremendous difference in the ability to get things done. President Ford was also a very close friend of my father and mother, and he said to me in my last interview with him before he died, he said, "Cokie, I don't understand what's going on in Washington." And this was well before it was anywhere near as bad as it is now. And he said, when your dad was majority leader and I was minority leader of the House of Representatives, we would get in a cab together and go downtown and say, okay, what are we going to argue about? And he said, but that was a genuine debate. We genuinely disagreed about means to an end. And it was partisan. For God's sake, we were the head of our parties in the House of Representatives. But then we get back in the cab and be best friends. And that was just a very different time. And people did not question each other's motives. They might question whether they were wrong-headed or not on policy, but they did not think they were evil. And that's all changed. And you see the effect of it is that it is very difficult to do anything and difficult to serve the American people the way that they deserve to be served. So it's been somewhat, to put it mildly, disheartening. And with this administration, it's just gotten worse. And so I wish we could go back to the time when our dads were such good friends.
Indeed. So. Noah, do you want to introduce the group?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So we're the juniors and seniors of the Mount Madonna Values and World Thought program. First of all, we just want to say thank you for speaking up with us.
Delighted to.
And we have some questions prepared, but if there's anything you'd like to say first, we'd be happy to hear it.
Well, tell me about the program. So you started this in 1989?
Yes.
That's a long time. Tell me some of the other things you do in the program, other than come to Washington. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the seniors at least have taken a trip down to South Africa together, and there we got to visit some townships and speak with students there.
Oh, interesting.
We got to visit a couple children's care centers and deliver some things, and then we got to speak with people who were involved with the anti-apartheid movement. So got to speak with Pregs Govinder, who was on Parliament until she resigned in protest for a weapons deal, right?
Yeah.
And then we spoke with Thulani Mabaso, who was one of the last prisoners released from Robben Island, Desmond Tutu.
Wow.
Yeah.
How fabulous.
We did an interview with de Klerk one year, too, which was really interesting.
Which must have been fascinating.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Absolutely fascinating. And what about during the school year when you're not on a trip? What kinds of activities do you all have?
We do small group discussions on different philosophers. We got a curriculum that he wrote in a textbook, and we basically discuss different passages from it and try and reach our own conclusions.
What kinds of philosophers?
Martha Nussbaum, Michael Sandel. Do you know Bill Moyers, his books? Yeah. A lot of people from his books.
So Bill actually allowed me to take his interviews and build a curriculum around it.
How terrific. He was probably thrilled.
Yeah. So the idea is to have them develop greater discernment through reflecting on ideas, seeing what they see, seeing what they don't see, and then through discussion to see what each other has seen. And so that's the basis of the program.
It's kind of what the founders did, in reading the works of the Enlightenment and then talking among themselves about it. It's really good. We seem to be getting away from the Enlightenment at the moment, but at any rate, let me hear your questions, and then we'll see where we are.
All right. Hi, I'm Jordan. My question is, in an interview with Larry King, you said, "These are the women who influenced the founding fathers, the women who influenced Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Madison and Washington. And when I thought about it, I really didn't know very much about them at all. Much of your work as a writer has been about sharing stories of people in history who are often not given a voice. Why do you believe this is such an important subject to explore? And what do you believe these stories can teach us today?"
Well, I think that the fact is that when I set about writing Founding Mothers, which came out in 2004, there was really nothing. It's improved a lot since then. There were a couple of good biographies of Abigail Adams, but that was about it. And, you know, you can't leave half of the human race out of history. It's basically inaccurate history if you leave out half of the human race. And I thought it was terribly important to write about and educate people about the contributions of these women, but also just what they were thinking and doing in everyday life. You get a much, much fuller picture of American life through the letters of women. Women's letters are just so much better than men's letters, because the men, you know, particularly in the founding period, but in any period, the men were very self-conscious, very aware that they were doing something extraordinary, and that if they succeeded, that they would be held in high acclaim. If they failed, they'd be hanged, so it got your attention. But if they succeeded, they would be big deals, and they knew that, and so they wrote with that in mind. So they wrote carefully, often on a single subject. They edited, they were pompous, and they just weren't letters. They were treatises, whereas the women wrote letters. They didn't expect me to be reading their mail 200 years later, and they wrote about everything. They wrote about the economy. They wrote a lot about politics from their perspective, which was quite interesting. But they also wrote about the economy, and they wrote about who was having and all too often losing children, and they wrote about fashion. And so you learn a much bigger picture of American life through their letters than through the men's letters. They also are much franker and funnier. You know, we see the founders as these bronze and marble statues. Their wives did not see them that way. And it's not, and I actually can make the case that strongly that it is not any denigration of these men to see them as human beings. In fact, it makes them far more admirable. It's easy for a deity to do something extraordinary. It's not so easy for a flesh and blood human. And they did something extraordinary. But they were flesh and blood humans, and their wives and friends and sisters and mothers certainly knew it. And some of the letters are just very extraordinarily frank and funny.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Ruby.
Hi, Ruby.
We recently interviewed the former Secretary of State George Shultz. So when we were talking with him, he spoke about how trust and accountability are very important values in our governance. Do you think that what we see in the media is simply spotlighting deficiencies in our country for the sake of getting views? Or do you think that trust and accountability are actually diminishing in the public sphere? And if so, how do you think we can address this?
Well, there's seldom been much trust in Congress. That's been sort of part of our history, is to laugh at Congress, and, you know, Will Rogers particularly. I mean, I was just reading a quotation of his the other day of, if you want to slow the aging process, send it through Congress. But so it's not unusual to have both the Congress and the media, originally the press, not held in high regard. And some of that is a sense of equality. You know, that everybody's equal, and that, you know, there's nobody fancier and smarter and all of that. Now that gets into problems when there actually are some people smarter, and there are facts. And what we're dealing with now is this terrible assault on the facts. I mean, talk about the men of the Enlightenment rolling in their graves. What the Enlightenment was all about was that there was, you know, actually reason could lead you to a set of facts that were real. And now the assault is on that. And actually, I would argue that it's coming more from the administration than from the media. What you're getting is this constant assault on the Department of Justice. I mean, just day in and day out. And that really is, you know, that has an effect. It has legs. And it's being done for political reasons, but I think it's very damaging in the long run. No. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Indigo.
Hi, Indigo.
In recent months, the Me Too movement has taken center stage, finally bringing into the public realm women's stories of harassment and assault. It seems that almost every woman I know has some experience to share. I'm wondering how we can create a safe space for women and men to discuss the subtle ways women experience harassment without blame and judgment.
Well, it'd be wonderful if we can. We're at a really rough spot right now, and I think part of that is because it's new. And so people are feeling not only the freedom to speak up, but almost the obligation to speak up. And in some cases, you kind of say, well, really? You know, and I actually do think, and older women will all say this, that young women are putting themselves in a somewhat precarious position because you have to make judgments. There's, you know, an off-color remark is not the same as rape, and it's all getting lumped together, and that becomes a big problem. I had the other day, I was at a board meeting where we were searching for a new CEO of the organization. The head of the search committee said, I guess we need to go back 20, 30 years, you know, now, and looking at if anything happened. And I said that was true, and to be really careful because young women were just on the warpath at the moment. And every woman in the room agreed with me. And then afterwards, a male head of a very, very important organization came up to me and said, I won't be alone in a room with a woman, and I won't send women on business trips. And so it's having a detrimental effect to some degree. So I think that it's important to make judgments and not just sort of throw it all out there. I also think it's very, very important for women's voices to be heard and for norms to be established and to be lived by, and for people to suffer the consequences if they're not. But it's a dicey time at the moment. We sort of have to get through this period and then get to a more sort of normal place.
Hi, I'm Cyrus.
Hi, Cyrus.
And as you become aware of an emerging story, it would seem that with facts available, that you would form certain opinions about the story. Given the speed of the news these days, do you have to be careful not to come to conclusions too fast?
Well, it's not an opinion so much as trying to get to basically what the truth is. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you really just can't find out what is the actual case. But most of the time you can, you know, talk to enough people and read enough that you can figure out what's actually going on and convey it. You don't really have an opinion about it. You just put it out there for the most part. Now I'm at a different stage of life where I write a column and I'm a commentator and can voice an opinion. I seldom do. And the reason for that is that I think that I am more credible of just being an analyst rather than a commentator. But every so often I will give an opinion. But as you're learning about a story, it's true that you can jump to a conclusion if that's what your question is, and that conclusion can be wrong. And sometimes it's because you want it to be true. And the best example of that I can give you is Dan Rather and the business about George Bush and the military, where he wanted it to be true that George Bush had not really served, and then ended up being fired over the story. And that is something that a reporter absolutely has to guard against, is to not think, oh, this is a great story, and then the facts get in the way. That does happen a lot. The facts get in the way of a good story, and shoot, that was going to be a humdinger. Well, wrong. And your question about the speed is quite legitimate. One of the things happening now with the 24/7 news cycle is that people are under pressure to be filing all the time. And if you're doing that, and tweeting and posting and all of that, and if you're doing that, you're not reporting. You're just filing. And so your reporting becomes derivative. You're reporting off of somebody else's reporting. And that's not what you're hired to do. You're hired to be a reporter. And you can't count on somebody else's reporting. So the speed of the news cycle is a problem in terms of just getting the facts and getting them right and having some ability to take a step back, take a look at the full picture and analyze it.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Samith, and as the story goes through several news cycles and more information comes in, do you ever find that your point of view shifts substantially?
Well, again, in my case, I don't really have a point of view. I'm just trying to get there. But it is true, for instance, this is years ago now, I was assigned a story for Nightline, which was at that point earlier in the evening, and not early, but earlier than it is now, and a straight news broadcast. And it was about breast implants and whether they were causing an illness, fibromyalgia. And the thesis going in, which was presented to me, was that the science all showed that there was no such thing as this effect, and that the whistleblowers and stuff were all wrong. And that was kind of a sexy story, right? I then started researching it, and I found that that was not necessarily the case at all. And the more I talked to more people, the less clear anything was. And I remember I finally wrote a lead saying there are no white hats and black hats in this story, only shades of gray. Now that didn't make my producers and editors happy, because they wanted a go-get-em story that was, going to show that the people were just nuts, and that wasn't what I found. And so I did a completely different story from what they wanted and what they expected, but I thought was a story that was telling the truth. So yes, the facts do guide the story, with any luck.
Hi, I'm Amy.
Hi, Amy.
I was wondering if you could talk about how the experiences of working for both public media and commercial broadcasting are different.
They're not as different as people seem to think they would be. I get that question a lot, as you can imagine. The main difference is length of story. On NPR, when I was covering Congress every day, a story would normally be about 4.5 minutes long, where you can get in a good bit of information. On commercial television, it's likely to be a minute and 15 seconds long. Now it's 45 seconds long. It gets shorter and shorter as people's attention spans get shorter and shorter. So it's the ability to tell a story with any kind of depth that is the main difference. The other big difference is a whole lot more people listen to NPR than watch commercial media.
Hi, my name
Hi.
is Sienna.
Hi, Sienna.
Do you think that growing up around prominent and powerful parents and their associates gave you a better ability to treat the prominent and powerful people as people and less as icons, and hold them more accountable for what they say and do?
Well, it certainly made me much more comfortable. I didn't see them again as brass and bronze and marble, and nor did Ward, and and they were comfortable with me because they knew that I had fundamental respect for the institution. When people would ask about bias, I would say, yes, I do have a bias. I have a bias for the Constitution and for the institutions that the founders created. And that includes a respect for Congress and the courts and the executive. Whereas most of my colleagues did not share that respect. It was more, they're all out for themselves and that kind of thing. And I don't believe that to be true. I don't believe that to be true in the current Congress. I think that most of them are there to serve the public by their lights. And I might disagree with those lights, but that's, I think, what their mission is. And I do think that it helped that not only that I had grown up around people who were, important in government, but that I knew a lot about it. I mean, I knew a tremendous amount about government. And we had been gone from Washington for 11 years when I came back and started working for NPR. And at first I kind of didn't want to be around Congress because I'd done that my whole life, but then it became ridiculous for me not to be. And so I would go up and do tutorials for people in the radio television gallery about what it means to call the previous question and stuff like that. So the fact that I had a tremendous amount of knowledge was very, very helpful, both in writing the stories, but also in being able to question people, because they couldn't really put anything over on me, and or much anyway. And the great joy of covering Congress is you can literally walk down the hall and get another point of view. Whereas in the White House, you sit there in a briefing room with news being bestowed upon you, and it's very difficult to then get someone else to say something that is questioning that. But I do think that it was extremely helpful to me. I also knew people in low places, and they often know more than anybody, or can certainly tell you things that are going on inside a closed room and that nobody else was able to get. And that was just because I had grown up there.
Hi, I'm Carl.
Hi, Carl.
So in an interview with the Berkshire Eagle, you said, as far as the charge of fake news, we do have to answer it. And the way you answer it is with real news. What must be done to remain credible, and what are the consequences if the trust in the Fourth Estate degrades?
Well, it already has. Now, it's never been high. When you ask people about institutions, the press is right there with used car salesmen, and a lot of that is just because people don't like people telling them, stuff. And although they consume it quite avidly. But I look back, and you all have all studied history now, you look back at the press of the 18th century, and they just made it up. It was total fiction. And the fact that the founders actually wrote and ratified the First Amendment is, to me, a constant source of awe and mystery, because if I were dealing with the press at that time, I don't think I would have been happy to give them freedom. But so I don't think it's new. I don't like it, but it's not new. Now, the fake news part is new. The distrust part is not new. The fake news part is new. And that is, again, that's done for political reasons. That's not, that's not a fact. It's just the opposite. It's saying, that what the facts are not true. And that is a new attack. And my feeling about that is that we have to be very adamant in calling it out and saying this is not true, and pretty much most news organizations are doing that now. The New York Times actually uses the word lie, which most people don't, but because it implies intent. But we have. I actually think in this era of being attacked as enemies of the people, the press has stepped up to the plate and is doing a very good job of reporting and of saying what's true and not true. And it's very, very important, more so than any time, that we get it right, so that there's not ammunition for the people calling it fake news. But that's all politics. It has nothing to do with reality. It has everything to do with trying to set a political agenda.
Hi, I'm Priyanka.
Hi.
In an NPR statement responding to criticism of your anti-Trump column, you wrote, I am a totally nonpartisan human being.
True.
I don't care which party has the right ideas or which party has the wrong ideas. I am very, very, very interested in civility. I am interested in government working. Can you speak more about how you are able to maintain civility and remain nonpartisan in such seemingly polarized times?
Well, I can remain civil, but they don't. It's as you say, terribly polarized times, but I am constantly trying to say that's not a good thing. And, come together. For God's sake, come together, people. America needs you. And the only real bastions of some bipartisanship is among the women in Congress. And they do tend to get together more across party lines, particularly on issues affecting women, children, and families, but on other issues as well. And I think part of it is that they hate the incivility, for the most part, not all of them, obviously. But part of it is also that there's a certain degree of, oh, for God's sake, let's just get this done. But it is, I think it's easy to remain civil yourself. It's just very difficult to deal with the incivility in the air around you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Sage.
Hi, Sage.
We spent a lot of time in class reading about and discussing the ways in which people participate in a democracy that goes beyond assembly voting. Now more than ever, it seems that our country needs active and engaged citizens. Could you talk a bit about what you think are the responsibilities of an engaged citizen, and do you see them changing or becoming more urgent in the current political climate?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't just give as a throwaway beyond just voting. Vote, for God's sake. We have way too few people voting, particularly people who feel marginalized, who are the people who should be the most interested in voting, because government policies tend to affect them the most. And so that I would start there. Vote, show up, vote. And if you're in a state where there have been laws that have been passed for the purpose of repressing the vote, which is true in many states around the country right now, then be part of an active group that gets people registered. And that might even mean like handing out $20 bills to somebody so that they can buy an ID card, because that's what it requires. But we are actually living in a time of greater activism than we have seen at any time since the 1970s. And members of Congress all report, I've actually done some stories on this, that they are getting much more contact from their constituents than they have in recent years. Much, much more. And that's great. That's really good. But I think the main thing to do is to speak up, to organize, to join organizations that already exist that you agree with, and to get people out to vote, to change what you disagree with in public policy. If you agree, fine, but then get people out to vote on that. But the main thing is organizing people to vote. Right now, that's the primary thing, I would say. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Annika.
Hi, Annika.
In an interview with Brian Lehrer in 2015, you talked about...
God, you all have know more about what I've said than I know.
You talked about the early woman journalist Jane Swisshelm rocking the boat by saying Daniel Webster was a drunk.
True story.
The male journalist then said, "We can't talk about this," or more specifically, "What gets said on the bus stays on the bus." In the light of the last presidential campaign, this statement was somewhat prophetic. What, if any, parallels do you see today pertaining to women's standing in the media today, and particularly in commenting on what happens on the bus?
Well, for years and years and years, it was all guys, and they'd go rollicking off covering campaigns and having a wonderful time, and nobody would ever report, what was going on, because they'd all get in trouble with their bosses and their wives, and so then women started showing up on the campaign trail, and we actually thought that it was significant of how a candidate treated women. So we would report on it. And the first big example of that was Gary Hart. But the fact is that we did not think that was personal. That if you're running for president, that the way you treat women and your attitudes toward women is political. And that was sort of a saying in the the feminist movement of the 70s. The personal is political. And so we started reporting on it, and it did change the way that candidates were assessed. And so when it got to the last campaign, and it was literally on the bus when the famous Access Hollywood tape was recorded, it was a big story. Now, it didn't affect the outcome. And it remains quite interesting that in this Me Too time, that people are getting called out in such numbers, except for the president. But I think that a lot of people feel strongly that we knew that and voted for him anyway. And but at least we knew it. I think it's important that we not let things like that not be known. And I do think that is a result of the influence of more women in the press corps. So.
Hi, I'm Gracie.
Hi.
You spoke about how your grandsons were outraged when they learned there's never been a female president.
Yes.
This struck me because it made me think about how children are not born racist, sexist, or homophobic.
Right.
Does being with your grandchildren and seeing how they think give you hope for the future?
Yes, oh yes. Young people, you all too. Young people give you tremendous hope, and particularly after the Parkland shootings. Those kids were just fabulous, and they remain fabulous. And, and I love the way they talk to politicians. It just made my heart sing. Some politician would say to them, well, I co-sponsored, bill number 5678, and these kids are saying, we are your children and we are dying, do something. Don't talk political gobbledygook to us. And they're having an effect. And one of the big things they're now doing is getting people to register to vote because, they're turning 18. And that's very important. So, yes, of course, young people do give me hope. My 5 out of 6 of my grandchildren are now teenagers. And it's a different era from when this interview took place. And they're hysterically funny. They all have very different political views. It's quite interesting. The ones in the most politically correct school have had it with that. So it's, they educate me all the time. And yes, give me hope, as do you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Phoebe.
Hi, Phoebe.
Next year I'm going to school to pursue my dream as an actress.
Oh, wow.
As a political and public figure, what would you say is the most difficult thing about being in the public eye on a regular basis?
People know what you do. First of all, you have to look decent. But people pay attention and can be highly critical, particularly in this era, the era of Twitter. People will say things like, just die. And my reaction is no. So it can be very harsh, and it can hurt your feelings a lot. My advice would be don't read any of it. But it's a much tougher time to be in the public eye than it used to be. People are because they're anonymous. They somehow find it rewarding to themselves to be mean. I don't get it. I don't understand why that would make you feel good. I just don't get it. But apparently it does make some people feel powerful. But that's no reason not to do it. It's your dream. Go ahead and do it. And not only can you provide the world with art that is meaningful and fun, but you can also, as a result of being in the public eye, have a public voice and use that for good. So, of course, go for it. But yes, there will be downsides, no question about it. There are upsides, a lot of upsides. People, total strangers can come up to you and say, we love your work. And actually, it's very interesting in this current climate. For the first time ever, I've had people in the past come up and say, we love your work. But what happens now all the time is people coming up and saying, keep doing what you're doing. It's really important. Hang in there. Don't stop. All of that. And that's brand new.
Hi.
Hi. Did you have any mentors growing up? And if so, what did you learn from them?
Well, so it was, a very different time in our history. My mentors were, first of all, my mother, who was a remarkable person, and very supportive, to put it mildly. But also the nuns. I was raised by Catholic nuns, and they were very, very adamant that we girls in the 1950s could achieve anything we wanted to achieve, which was radical at the time. And they gave us a very solid education. So that was really where sort of inspiration came from. I always joke with them now that you told us we could be anything we wanted to be except priests, and we were bitter about that. When I came into the world of work, there were really very few female models. But my husband was a journalist always from the time he was like 9 years old. So he was really my biggest mentor when I started working in journalism.
Hi, my name is Lucas.
Hi.
Is there any particular story, subject, or person you covered that had a lasting impact on you? And if so, what do you still carry from the experience?
There's so many, and they're so different from each other that I'm never any good about the best, the worst, all of that. There are times when you're just kind of overwhelmed. When you're dealing with someone who's lost a child, it's just overwhelming, and you can't help but put yourself in that position. Think, how horrible it would be. Those are really tough interviews and stories to do after disasters, usually, and when people have lost everything, it's hard. And then there's stories that are just complicated. Like the Iran-Contra situation was, where I actually think as a whole that we in the press did a bad job of conveying the importance of that situation. And then there's stories that are just fascinating, like the election of a pope, which is a scream to cover, because nobody knows what they're talking about. And and you're in Rome, in the 15th century, and it's a ball. You have a wonderful time doing it, but it is crazy. But it's it's fun to do, and you're in Rome, never a bad thing. And there's stories that that you sort of do carry with you. When I covered the nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island, that was one of those situations where getting to the truth was really hard, where nobody really was an expert, and people had views but not facts, and it was a really tough story. You have things like that live on. But my basic view is that it's the body of my work that I feel good about. That I've done 50 years of journalism, and the coverage of American government and politics is a body of work, and that's kind of what I leave behind.
So before we get towards the last question, I want to take a little break here and ask what you guys have heard so far that's really touched you or struck you, so you can let Cokie hear what's landing in those brains of yours.
Up over here.
I liked hearing about the men and women's letters, and how the women's were way more interesting and candid. That was just fun to hear.
So, let me just give you an example. So Verena Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, Jefferson Davis was a horrible person, but she was really neat. She was this really interesting, smart woman. And she was furious when another woman in Washington, this is before the Civil War, shortly before the Civil War, a woman named Adele Cutts, who was Dolly Madison's great niece, married Stephen Douglas, the man who ran against Lincoln, you know the Lincoln-Douglas debates and all that, and won for the Senate. Stephen Douglas won. Verena Davis hated Stephen Douglas, and Adele Cutts was going to marry him, and she was furious. And she says she writes a letter to her mother and says, this is a terrible situation. This drunken old man who's living off his first wife's money gets a beautiful, brilliant woman because she's poor and her father's proud. And then she says, and you would never read this in a man's letter. Then she says, it's a good thing a new water system is being built in Washington, so Douglas may bathe a little oftener. Otherwise, he will offend his wife's olfactories, and we will all have to build bigger rooms with more perfect ventilation. Now, you don't read in men's letters that Stephen Douglas stinks, and that's just it's just a hysterically funny, but tiny example. It's on and on like that, where they just tell you things that you would never know otherwise, and they just crack you up. I'll just tell you one more. Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, when he was Secretary of State, the Missouri Compromise was worked out in 1820, the first Missouri Compromise. And Congress stayed in session much longer than usual because they were hammering out the compromise. And the women of Washington, the political women, joined with the local women after the British invasion of 1814 to form an orphan asylum because girls had been left orphaned. And the fancy women became trustees. And she went to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum in 1820, and they told her that they were going to have to build a new building. And she said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, the session had been very long, and the fathers of the nation had left 40 cases to be provided for, and we will have to do that. They had left 40 pregnant women behind. And she said, and I've looked up, there were only 187 members of Congress at the time. So some of them might have been recidivist, I don't know. But then she says she's just furious when she discovers this. 40 pregnant women left behind by the Congress. And she's writing this letter to her father-in-law, John Adams. And she says, so I suggested in the next session that these great and moral leaders should take the $2 additional that they've voted themselves as an increase in pay and use it for the creation of a foundling institution. Now, again, that letter had never been published anywhere. I discovered it in her papers. And, you would never know from anything else in 1820 that you had these men just cavorting around Washington, leaving behind women in need, So it's fabulous stuff.
I loved what you're saying about your respect for the federal system and how it's helped you with answering questions and having thoughtful discussion. I love hearing that. That's been a common theme.
Well, that's good. Yeah. Well, the founders had it right. Which is remarkable when you think about it. Think about it. These 13 little states huddled on the Atlantic Ocean. And these men in their, starting with the Declaration, some of them in their 20s and 30s, by the Constitution, a few years older, just a few. It was only 11 years later. And they write this document that is still so relevant and important 200 years later with a country, 10 times the size, diverse beyond belief, all of that. It's still our guiding document. The rotunda at the archives, I always say, is the closest thing we have to a national chapel because it's quiet and dark because the documents are fading so much. And it's got the Declaration here, the Constitution here, and the Bill of Rights here. And I, as a Catholic, I always say it's like, the St. Joseph's altar, the main altar, Our Lady's altar, and I love that Our Lady gets the Bill of Rights. But it really is, those are our charters of freedom, and that is the closest thing we have to a place where we can commonly worship, because we are so different. But that's the thing that glues us together. Those are the things that make America America.
I liked what you said about how with the new system, or somewhat new system of the 24/7 news cycle and the different outlets like with social media and stuff, it makes it harder to produce or at least inform the people, a majority of them, with facts, and it kind of like creates more polarization, you could say. And I also liked what you said about how respect is not a word that's used enough, but you need it for a functioning society and healthy relationships.
Good.
So.
Yeah, I do think that the media is an unindicted co-conspirator in the polarization. That not only do you have, MSNBC and Fox just going, with, completely different worlds, right? But even the mainstream media, the tendency is to give the microphone to the loudest shouters, and that does just keep the polarization heated up.
Another common theme in the other interviews that we've done is that women make up half of the population, and or more, yeah, at least half, and you really can't leave half of the population behind. And especially in Milan Revere's interview that we did with her,
she's great.
Yeah, she said it's just about human rights. Women's rights are human rights.
Right, and that, Hillary Clinton said that when she went to Beijing for the women's conference. Laura Bush said it emphatically after 9/11 when she was giving the president's radio address on Afghan women. And it is absolutely the case, but it's also the case. Look, you all see it in your class. I'm sure the girls are getting better grades. The fact is the vast majority, the majority of college graduates are now female, and the vast majority of graduate school graduates are female. And so you can't have a competitive world-class society if you leave out those people, and so the challenge that has not been met, and less so in our developed nation than in most developed nations, is the ability to balance work and family, and not just family. People need to be able to contribute to their families, to the community, to all kinds of entities, and the workplace has to be more friendly to making that happen, so that they do get the best and the brightest.
I really appreciated hearing your view on the Me Too movement, because I think a lot of people hadn't necessarily thought of it from your viewpoint, and so that was really interesting to hear your side of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You all just need to call them out, absolutely, but be sure that what you're calling out is serious.
So first, I just wanted to say about what you were saying about responsibility to help people, especially about responsibility to help with women's rights. Not just that it's like a good thing to do, but we actually have an obligation to do that. And I think that's interesting. It ties in a little bit with earlier we interviewed John Lewis. He's also really big on that. It's not just a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do, you have to do it.
But it's also not just the right thing to do. It's the savvy thing to do. It's the, it's the thing that's going to get you further than if you don't do it. So it's the smart thing to do.
We've seen a number of women from that network. So one of the objectives of this program is also to bring our students, into kind of an awareness.
That's great. Well, Vital Voices does tremendous work with women around the world, and that is quite something that they've been able to put together there. Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, continues to do that work as well. Twice, I had the great privilege of interviewing her and Michelle Obama together, and the story there is really quite interesting. So George and Laura Bush were very involved in Africa. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, has saved millions and millions of African lives. And so they've stayed involved in Africa, and they were putting together a First Ladies Summit in Africa a few years back, and then realized that the Obamas happened to be on the continent at the same time. So obviously, you invite Mrs. Obama to a First Lady of Africa summit, right? And she could have taken over the whole thing. She could have given a big keynote and she would have been all the news, and that would have been, she could have hijacked the whole thing. And instead, what she said was, well, I'll come, but I want to be interviewed with Laura. I want us to talk together to these women, and which was incredibly gracious. And then there was all this toing and froing about who would conduct the interview. And I'm at the beach, and I get a call from the Bush people saying, "Can you be in Tanzania next week?" And I said, "No." And then I told my husband, and he said, "Why can't you be in Tanzania next week?" "Okay, I'll go to Tanzania." And I called ABC and said, "Can you find a way to send me to Tanzania?" And they said, "Oh, sure." And so off to Tanzania I went and interviewed the two of them, and it was terrific. They were great, and the First Ladies of Africa were incredibly impressed because, the succession system there in many countries is not great. It's death. And so seeing this, women of two parties talking together, being friends, talking about the common good, all of that was very impressive to them. And I then at the end said to Mrs. Obama, I said, you wanted to do this. You could have given a speech, but you wanted to have this interview together. Why? And she reached out and grabbed Laura Bush's hand and said, "Because I love this woman. And she has really made a difference in my ability to be a good First Lady." Well, it was just fabulous, right? I mean, think of that. Now, even then, though, talk about, hostile coverage. I said as a breaker, a sort of mood breaker to get everybody relaxed, I said, Martha Washington said, it's being in the White House is not easy. Martha Washington wrote that people call me the First Lady of the land. I feel more like the chief state prisoner. And so I said to them, as joking, so is it a state prison? And they both laughed. And one said, well, Obama said, yes, it can be a little like a prison. And Laura says, but with a good chef, and like that. So one New York newspaper says, Obama says White House is prison, so you never get away from that, But they took it with good humor. And then the next year, the summit was here. And we did it again, and a lot of the Vital Voices people were there because it was at the Kennedy Center, but it was such a role model for other First Ladies, and they really took it to heart. It was terrific.
One thing I noticed listening to you is how much probably both of us were influenced, and I'm realizing maybe I was influenced more than I realized.
Right.
By our fathers,
right.
And the way they pursued facts in order to support policy.
Right.
I remember when I was in college coming home being very upset with my dad because he voted on an oil depletion allowance bill.
Right.
And
well, from Louisiana, you always for oil depletion allowance.
Yeah, and he said, let me give you the facts I had when I voted. He proceeded to lay them out, and by the time he got done, to my consternation, I realized he was right. I've never quite gotten over that. But the impact of being around statesmen, as I know you were, being around your dad, and when my dad would come over for, or Millie would come over for drinks and that kind of thing, did you sit and listen and take that in?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
we were invited to the table if it was small enough group that we could fit, it was my brother and sister used to say that some people have fine art and fine antiques. We had Lyndon Johnson and Jerry Ford.
Exactly.
So, but it was a wonderful education. Really was.
Yeah, I remember sitting with Earl Warren because he and my grandmother celebrated their birthdays together on the same day, and listening to him when he was still Chief Justice, to my delight, going off on
Fabulous.
The overreaction of the police in Berkeley.
Huh.
Now that's something you would never
hear.
Ever
There's
know.
a new book out just reviewed yesterday of Eisenhower and Warren that sounds quite interesting. Yeah. So, but yeah, you were there in California, and there he was.
Absolutely, and I wanted to ask, but I was scared to ask,
Yeah.
and someone else did, and I was so amazed.
Right.
You know, so that's
And
things
then
you
there were
just
things
don't
like
hear.
Sam Rayburn, who was the Speaker of the House for many, many years, was a very close friend. He was not married and had no children. So we were like grandchildren. One day, my chicken had died, and we were burying him, Charlie Chicken, and my brother was singing Dragnet at his funeral. And I came running in the house and said to Mr. Sam, "Tommy's singing Dragnet at Charlie Chicken's funeral." So Mr. Sam went out and presided over the funeral and sang some good Baptist hymn, and Charlie Chicken was given a proper burial. But those kinds of experiences you just can't replicate.
No, you can't.
Right.
No, you can't. But it's so interesting to hear. I can hear my father's voice, your father's voice.
Well, that's a good thing. And my mother, very much my mother's voice. Yeah, so. Well, I'm so glad you all came to visit. Should we take some pictures? Would you like
Would
to
love
do
to
that?
take a picture.
Okay.
Love to take a picture.
All right.